guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and in this week's build of the War Within beta, we saw a bunch of new class changes, some of it being a lot of different tunings, but also actual adjustments between hero talents to make sure that all of the different options available for classes are starting to become a little bit more competitive, with even more hotfixes that have rolled out over the last few weeks. One of those classes being Shaman, with all three hero specs of the Farseer, the Stormbringer, and the Totemic getting some considerable additions, whether it is quality of life improvements for Restoration Shaman, some actual nerfs for enhancement, especially playing around the Tempest ability, and the Farseer Elemental is getting a bit of a juice up as of this week. So I really wanted to do a bit of a deeper dive at everything Shaman from this week's beta build. As always, if you guys enjoy this regular beta updates for the War Within, be sure to follow the channel. Otherwise, let's dive right in. So as part of the Shaman update, I want to first start off with some of the general changes, and we got a pretty interesting one, which I'm still not sure exactly how I feel about, but it is for Stone Bulwark Totem. Out of all the different changes that we've gotten, that is like the most general one that happened this week specifically, but Stone Bulwark Totem is a new totem that was recently added on a couple of builds ago when Shaman got a pretty big rework. It is a totem that's supposed to give you a pretty big shield every time you drop it. It's a decent totem, but it just wasn't quite good. It has an instant shield effect and then kind of like a refreshing shield effect. So they recently buffed it and changed it, where now instead of being a 2-minute totem, it is now a 3-minute totem, but it also says its effectiveness has been significantly increased. So this means that now every time you drop the totem, it gives you shield for 2.3 million health, which is quite a bit. The totem itself also does add additional shielding every few seconds to refresh the actual effectiveness of the shield, which is a portion of that the 2.3 million bonus, which right now it's about 250,000, which is like a quarter of a million health. So after a few seconds, it can build up close to another million of shielding. So I guess this change does make the totem a little bit better as an overall protection element, but I guess it makes the totem a little bit more effective when you do use it. I'm still a little bit on the fence with this one. I want Totemic Bulwark to be, or Stone Bulwark rather, to be a good totem, to be a powerful defensive, but they're having to play around with cooldowns as well as effectiveness. I do prefer the more effective version, but the 3-minute cooldown does feel kind of hefty. Besides this, we got a bunch of hero talent adjustments for Shamans, with all three of them getting a bit of updates, with Farseer probably seeing the most amount of improvements. Farseer being a playstyle whenever you use your Primordial Wave ability or Unleash Elements, or not Unleash Elements, which one is it? Not Unleash Elements, Unleash Life. I was almost close, but Unleash Life, Resto, Primordial for Elemental, it summons up ancestors to mimic your abilities. Single target abilities they mimic to be other single target abilities, AoE mimics to be AoE, heals are meant to mimic heals. So it kind of allows you to summon these extra NPCs that are not targetable that will add additional extra benefits, like increasing your overall power, and as well as they will do some damage on their own as well. So this one is getting buffed all across the board. The lava bursts from these the ancestors themselves are buffed by 25%, chain lightning buffed by 50%, Healing Surge, great for healers, buffed by 60%. The Ancestral Swiftness, which basically gives you a better version of Nature Swiftness that also forces one of these not elementals, but the ancestors to be summoned up, while improving the effectiveness of that spell by 10%. That is now a 30-second cooldown, down from 45. With the talent of Heed My Call, the ancestors will last a little bit longer, from a 2-second buff to a 4-second buff, which is overall 100% improvement for that talent instead. With the Ancient Fellowship talent, where ancestors, when they fade, there's a chance they'll just summon a new one, so they'll just give you a free ancestor that kind of rotates in. So that's been increased to 20%, up from 15%, and apparently it's a little bit less random, so I imagine they added some kind of a bad luck protection for the Farseer playstyle. Specifically concerning Elemental Shaman, I felt that the Farseer gameplay, in terms of its interaction with the abilities, has always felt pretty good. So being given Farseer as a bit of a buff as an overall, I think is a good move in general. It is just one of those, if you take the damage numbers out of the equation completely, it is one playstyle that feels pretty good to integrate. Even though it's fairly passive, there is a little bit of interactivity, there is a little bit of this element of we can kind of rotate all of these ancestors out when you need them for additional extra burst, and plus having the extra NS that's a shorter cooldown, this is instant cast heal, that is super nice. It's one of those things that adds a bit of convenience for the Shaman, and I overall like the hero talents a bit more now that I've gotten to play with it, especially as elemental. When you compare Farseer with Stormbringer, Farseer really does end up standing out a little bit more. So this is an overall buff for Farseer, where Totemic has become a much more popular choice, even though it has some bugs for restoration, but it may actually end up being kind of a little bit more even with Farseer and Resto after this change. I think it will really be more fight dependent more than anything, but there is definitely some advantages for Totemic as Resto, but these changes at the very least do make it slightly better for Resto, if anything. And as for the gameplay of Elemental with Farseer, this one is where I really do want to drive it home. This one feels incredibly good. I will talk a bit more about how Elemental plays, especially with Farseer, a little later in the section of the video when we talk about Elemental specifically and how they've been feeling so far in the beta, but just letting you know right now, this one does definitely have its advantages. The other hero talent of Elemental and Enhancement, which is Stormbringer, this one actually saw a few nerfs, which is unfortunate, but also understandable, although I feel like Elemental getting caught in the crossfire because this one seems more an enhancement nerf than anything. Now, Stormbringer itself, the Tempest ability, has a bit of a variance in terms of how good it is for Elemental as well as enhancement, and as well as playability and the synergies. It's definitely more synergetic for enhancement, but besides Stormbringer, the rest of the actual talents are actually all quite good in terms of some of the passives, and those passives are actually seeing a bit of a nerf, such as Stormcaller, which gives you increased critical strike chance on nature-based abilities as well as critical strike damage. The critical strike chance has been reduced from 10% to 5%. The Tempest itself ability, the actual secondary cleave damage, has also been reduced from 70% of the initial single target damage to 50%. With the talent of unlimited power, spending Maelstrom grants you now 1% haste instead of 3% haste stacking, which is translated into elemental or Maelstrom weapon charges for elemental or enhancement more than anything. I'm getting my two specs of Shamans confused here. The talent of Arc Discharge, which has been a very popular choice and a lot more popular than Storm Swell in comparison, because it's just such a good one and actually improves the rotation feel in AoE. When Tempest strikes more than one target, your next 2 Chain Lightnings can be cast instantly and will deal 75% increased damage. This went from 3 Chain Lightnings to 2 Chain Lightnings, which definitely squares back that Chain Lightning effectiveness for enhancement, for both elemental and enhancement, but for enhancement specifically. And for Enhancement Shaman, Conductive Energy, which essentially grants you the talent of a Lightning Rod, the variation of the Lightning Rod for Enhancement in particular, which is a very popular talent and a very powerful choice, this one is getting reduced from a 10% damage that will be redirected back, or from 20% damage redirected back into a Lightning Rod, down to 10%, so that's a 50% reduction there. Man, honestly, just seeing some of these changes, Enhancement is really getting beat up right now back to back with Stormbreaker. It is a very popular pick and a very powerful choice. Compared to Totemic, I see more Stormbringer Enhancement Shamans, but if you played this build, if you played the playstyle, it is so good when you put it together. It is such a good place. It is so effective. It is such high energy, high damage build. I'm a big fan of the Stormbringer as enhancement, but it looks like it's catching strays left and right. And the thing is, Elemental also is seeing nerfs because of these changes. Even though Stormbringer is an effective hero spec choice for Elemental, it just doesn't really get as much of favorability compared to Farseer, where Stormbringer is a little bit, I mean, the ability of Tempest is, you can get used to it, but it still is a little bit janky if you're trying to make like a full lightning build. Whereas for Elemental, I think the Farseer just ends up being a little bit easier to spec into. With Stormbringer, you can make builds that don't necessarily focus on lightning, where Tempest can be a very powerful ability all on its own, but it ends up being kind of like this, like, you're really going away from the thematic aspects of this nature damage and lightning-based playstyle, which Stormbringer really tries to encourage you into. Then we have ourselves Totemic, which gotten a few changes for enhancement and restoration specifically. For enhancement, Surging Totem, the ability itself, is actually being a bit adjusted. Surging Totem now will deal flame strike damage instead of full physical damage. This is a scaling factor for enhancement specifically because you have talents and abilities and other passive procs and other active procs that can increase the damage of your fire abilities or physical abilities. So when you do get those, Surging Totem gets direct damage increases from all of those effects. So adding a scaling factor does mean that the ability will also see a 35% damage loss passively, but now it has a bit of this upward potential, which could be very interesting with being Flame Strike. This allows you to potentially spec into not purely physical Storm Striker damage, but also Lava Lash damage. And that could be potentially interesting, especially with you Ghost Wolves as well. If you get a lot more Fire Wolves proccing, for example, like with the Elemental Wolves, that could be also interesting there. Also, the ability itself of certain totem, the tremor damage that it does is actually also scales with haste. So let's say during Bloodlust or any of the higher haste windows as an enhanced Shaman, like let's say with Splintered Elements for instance, that ability is actually going to be a bit more effective during those high haste situations where it will pulsate a lot more frequently. This is a good change, I think, in general, to make Totemic just a little bit better for enhancement, and I think the scaling potential could be something good for Enhanced to follow through with. As for the Restoration Totemic changes, Imbuement Mastery increases duration of Earth Living Weapon by 3 seconds, which was originally 6 seconds. As well as some adjustments to the Lively Totem's passive, where your Healing Tide Totem, Healing Stream Totem, Cloudburst Totem, Mana Tide Totem, and Spirit Link Totem, basically all of your water totems, cast a free, instant chain heal at 100% effectiveness when you summon them. This is an instant cast heal, which is actually kind of effective, but this proc would essentially eat a bunch of other different effects, kind of automatically making it a lot buggier to play into. Things such as your Whirling Elements Air proc. Every time you drop your totem, you get a bunch of different elements procking all at once. And you have all these kind of totem elements swirling around your totem, and you have these different buffs. The air buff specifically is a buff where the casting move next healing spell is reduced by 40%, where you would, if you drop down a healing totem and you would cast Free Chain Lightning, that would actually be consumed, which is super annoying. So a lot of other benefits such as Nature Swiftness, Tidal Waves, or Tidebringer, all of those things no longer get consumed by Lively Totems, which is just an upgrade, a much needed bug fix that probably should have happened last week also. Healing Surges also don't consume Whirling Air buff, which is the air element of Whirling Elements, while the buff of Spirit Walker's Tidal Totem is active, which allows you Healing Surges to have a much faster cast time. Therefore, you want to end up having to double dip into both of the debuffs, kind of cannibalizing one of the buffs, while another one is basically doing a similar job. Also, in general, if you're playing with Nature Swiftness and you do get the proc of the air Whirling Elements, you no longer have that spell consume Whirling Elements automatically, which makes Totemic and the Whirling Elements air component even better and a lot more consistent, so you can actually finally utilize it as of this week's build. Now from here on, I'm going to talk about some of the different changes that happen to the different specs of Shaman, starting with Elemental, which isn't a lot of things. It's mostly little bug fixes, though not all of those bug fixes in a blue post are actually, I guess there's some that have been adjusted recently that didn't make it into the blue post. So they did things such as your Thunderstrike Ward has now its own spell visual, the Thunderstrike Ward no longer drops off randomly, Earthquake triggers from Storm Frenzy on cast only, which is this talent right here, where this talent basically buffs the cast time of your Chain Lightning and Lightning Bolt every time you Earthshock, Eldritch Blast, or Earthquake. So this used to kind of refresh and give you a stack every time Earthquake ticked. So in AoE it was really fun where you could just spam Chain Lightning a bunch. This no longer works, so this makes the Lightning focused builds, like your Tempest builds, a little bit less good to some degree. And they also ended up fixing a talent of Echoes of the Great Sundering, where certain talents in the Shaman talent tree allow you to gain free procs of Elemental Blast, such as Fusion of Elements, where after casting Ice Fury, the next time you cast a Nature and a Fire spell, you additionally cast an Elemental Blast at your target at 60% effectiveness. This talent used to proc the talent of Echoes of Great Sundering, where after casting Elemental Blast, your next Earthquake deals 140% additional damage, which allowed you to kind of watch out for procs of Ice Fury and set up Ice Fury in such a way where you proc Ice Fury, cast a Fire spell, cast a Nature spell, drop down Earthquake immediately. So this would allow you to set up a very interesting synergy where we essentially were planning for a pseudo or a false version of an Elemental Blast to get even more AoEs from your Earthquake, and it was actually kind of a fun playstyle. It had a bit of a nuance to it, and at first we thought that this was intentional. Apparently Blizz confirmed recently that this change and the adjustment where Echoes of Great Sundering no longer works off of Fusion of Elements, this is an intentional change. This was not supposed to be a thing, even though I thought the interaction between the two was very fun to kind of play around with. Now it's a little bit more boring. This does mean that Elemental AoE drastically is going to go down by quite a bit when it comes to AoE and Mythic Plus content, which is unfortunate. Either way though, Elemental still feels really good to play, even though you are going to be seeing a lot less Earthquakes overall, which is going to lead to a significant damage decrease. But the playstyle itself does feel pretty good, and I think it is something that could potentially be altered with tuning and adjustments, because tuning is by no means final over in the beta, and they may end up going back and reverse some of these changes. Not the first time they went back and changed something and then they reversed it just because the community liked the old version. And I really did like that interaction with Elder Blast and Earthquake and how you had to watch out for it, but also how you could set it up and kind of almost skip a step of have it to Elder Blast, then build up Maelstrom, have it to Earthquake. Being able to skip that step once in a while was really cool and encouraged you to really lean into that heavy lava burst playstyle and gave lava Earthquake interaction a bit more of an interesting nuance to it. But either way, it is still a highly effective spec. It is a ton of fun to play, and overall with the Farseer changes, it feels pretty good to spec into. As long as the Farseer is numerically decent, I think it might end up being a more favored playstyle overall. It's an easier spec to pick up in general. I think it fits the elemental playstyle a little bit better, and compared to Stormbringer, which has you really trying to lean into a heavy lightning setup, Stormkeeper, full lightning build combo, I just haven't found it nearly as effective. This is a problem we saw during season 2 of Dragonflight, where Thunder Shaman became essentially the single target and AoE build. I personally liked it, but there was always a bit of jank and a little bit of weirdness about the rotation. It didn't feel like as natural as the current or the recent versions of Shaman with this whole lava burst setup felt. They weren't as smooth, they weren't as I guess fluid. You really had to stand still and play around this very strict rotation in order to get effective damage, but it just meant you kind of had to stand still and essentially become a turret, compared to being able to run around spamming lava bursts everywhere and then dropping Elder Blasts and Earthquakes left and right. It's a lot more fun doing that than having to play around the rigid rotation, and Stormbreaker somewhat invokes that to a degree. But I'm hoping at the end of the day, like, I like the playstyle of Elemental Shaman generally. I'm just hoping the tuning will end up keeping him relevant going forward, because I do like this playstyle a ton. I've been a fan of it for a good bit, and I like this version that they got going on right now over for the beta, as well as in the pre-patch version, and I'm hoping that it'll just be competitive. I've been loving Elemental Shaman, and hopefully there'll be a ranged class that'll be accepted by many groups out there, because it's a ton of fun, and if you haven't checked it out, at least in pre-patch, you definitely should. As for enhancement shamans, we actually got a very interesting set of changes with the ability of Primordial Wave. So Primordial Wave used to be a Shadowlands ability that did shadow damage, but activated the ability for you to have a cleave with your lightning bolts and everything like that. And then at some point they changed Primordial to be an elemental ability and even gave it a different visual to kind of separate it from Shadowlands. But with it being an elemental ability, it apparently didn't scale with certain buffs for enhancement shaman. Talents like Fire and Ice now directly buff the damage of Primordial ability, since it is elemental damage, a fusion of Fire, Frost, and Nature. Even the talents like Nature's Fury that increase critical strike chances of nature spells and abilities also now work towards Primordial Wave. And as a latest recent build, Primordial Wave now scales with the Mastery of Enhancement Shamans, which causes them to not only trigger more procs to Stormbringer and Wind Fury weapon, but also increases the damage of all Fire, Frost, and Nature spells by 34%, scaling with your mastery. Also, if you're playing the Feral Spirits and you pick up the Elemental Spirits, your Feral Spirits now imbued with Fire, Frost, or Lightning, increasing that element's damage by 20%. All of those effects now scale with Primordial Wave, but the baseline damage of Primordial Wave has been lowered, so now Primordial Wave itself has some scaling potential. As for the Restoration Shaman, which by the way feels pretty great to play over in the beta, we've seen mostly quality of life fixes. So things such as your Tidebringer, this buff is no longer consumed when you have Nature Swiftness or Ancestral Swiftness active. With Tidebringer reducing the cast move next chain heal after a handful of seconds, you kind of don't want to have your instant cast ability consuming Tidebringer at the same time, otherwise that'd be wasteful and gives you a very awkward way that you have to play around the talent and the two different synergies. Earth Living Weapon is another one that got adjusted, where the healing over time duration of this ability is now reduced to from 12 seconds to 6 seconds, but the healing itself is increased by 75%, which I assume is just going to make it a little bit burstier and just makes Earth Living Weapon more instantly effective, not really making Restoration too much of a healing over time spec, but allows it to gain a little bit more upfront potential with the ability when you do get the proc for it. Then we have the talent of Adulation, which no longer triggers from additional heals generated by Primordial Waves, which is unfortunate, so you can't stack up Adulation as quickly as you used to before. And Undulation now displays and highlights the healing surge or the healing wave when the ability triggers instead of being consumed immediately. So I guess it's mostly just another quality of life adjustment, but it does mean that Undulation is probably it's a little bit weaker because of the Primordial Wave interaction though. Besides this, however, Restoration Shaman generally has been, I think, one of the more popular healers over the last few weeks, just in the generality when it comes to Mythic Plus dungeons, at least over on the beta. At least there's a lot of logs where people are picking up and trying out Restoration Shamans, especially when it comes to some of the higher end keys. The class itself has proven itself to be quite powerful when it comes to spot healing in dungeon situations, plus the passive damage it offers is kind of nice, and the big utility belt of totems I think has been really good, plus giving them a bit more survivability thanks to the Stone Bulwark totem upgrades as of this week. I think could potentially make him just a little bit more effective in that regard specifically. But overall, it's good to see the Restoration Shaman is at least kind of sort of thriving. Again, really just subject to tuning, but at least we've seen a lot of Restoration Shamans over in the beta, and I think generally that's a good sign. And with that, that's going to be everything that happened this week in beta for the class of Shaman, at least so far. We've still got a couple of weeks left until the expansion fully releases, so you never know, maybe there'll be even more updates, which I wouldn't be surprised by. As always, I do want to thank all of you so much for watching, and I hope all of you guys enjoyed. If you did enjoy the video or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community, link to that is down in the description of every single video, and let me know your thoughts of everything we talked about so far. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.